It was an early morning like any other. The soft golden light filtered through the blinds of the Morrison household, casting long shadows across the kitchen table where Sheriff David Morrison sat sipping his first cup of coffee. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of dew from the creek behind the house. Outside, birds chirped softly, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the tall oak trees that lined the neighborhood. David had always treasured these quiet moments before the chaos of the day began. His daughter Sophie, a sweet and gentle 5-year-old, was still asleep, wrapped in the warmth of her purple blanket in the next room. Sophie was special, diagnosed with autism at the age of 3, and had a routine that brought her calm and comfort. Every morning, without fail, she would wander to her favorite spot by the creek, a short walk from their backyard. The sound of flowing water soothed her like nothing else could. It was a ritual David and his wife Emily cherished because it helped Sophie stay grounded. But that morning, the peace was broken, in a way David could never have imagined. From the kitchen window, David's eyes caught a commotion by the creek. A woman was shouting loudly, waving her arms aggressively. His heart sank as he recognized her instantly. Margaret Ellison, the HOA president. Margaret was notorious in their neighborhood for her iron-fisted control and disdain for anyone who didn't conform to her strict rules. Everyone whispered behind her back, calling her Karen for her bossy, entitled attitude. David dropped his coffee cup in shock as he saw Margaret approach Sophie, who sat quietly on the grass, her hands fluttering in the air, a behavior David recognized as her way of self-soothing. Margaret's voice was sharp and angry, cutting through the serene morning air. "You can't be here," she yelled at Sophie. "This is HOA property, and you need to leave now." Sophie looked up with wide, confused brown eyes. She didn't understand the anger or the shouting. Her world was one of routines and gentle rhythms, not of hostility and fear. David leapt from the kitchen, his father's instincts flaring to life. But before he could reach them, Margaret's hand closed tightly around Sophie's small arm. "Let her go," David shouted. But Margaret didn't release his daughter. Margaret's grip on Sophie's arm was strong, almost painfully so. Sophie cried out, a sound David had never heard before. A raw, piercing cry filled with fear and pain. It cut through him like a knife. The sight of his fragile daughter struggling against a woman twice her size was unbearable. Margaret dragged Sophie towards the old wooden bridge that spanned the creek. A spot Sophie loved, but also a place that could be dangerous for a child her size. The bridge stood about 6 feet above the creek, which was shallow but filled with jagged rocks and cold, fast-moving water. David's legs moved faster than his mind could process. He sprinted across the yard, heart hammering in his chest. "Stop! Let go of her!" he bellowed, but Margaret, red-faced and filled with rage, didn't stop. Sophie's tiny pink shoes scraped against the gravel path as she tried to keep up, her small legs trembling. She wore her favorite yellow dress, now marked with dirt from the ground. Margaret shoved Sophie hard towards the edge of the bridge. Time seemed to slow as David's mind screamed for him to do something, anything. With a terrified scream, Sophie lost her balance and fell. The splash of water and Sophie's scream echoed through the trees. David reached the bridge just in time to see his daughter flailing in the cold creek, water rushing past her, her dress soaked and muddy. David dropped everything and plunged into the creek, the water colder than he expected. Sophie's small body was shivering violently as he pulled her close. "Daddy's here," he whispered urgently, cradling her like a precious treasure. She clung to him tightly, her fingers digging into his shirt. Her lips were blue from the cold, and her little body trembled uncontrollably. Despite the trauma, Sophie began to hum softly, a sad, scared sound, trying to calm herself. David felt tears sting his eyes as he carried her up the muddy bank, careful not to slip on the wet stones. Margaret stood on the bridge above them, arms crossed, and a cruel smile plastered across her face. "You should control your kid," she spat, her voice cold and unfeeling. "This isn't a playground for children like her. They always cause problems." David felt a wave of rage crash through him. How could someone be so heartless? How could she not see the damage she had caused to this innocent child? But Sophie needed him. So instead of confronting Margaret then and there, David gently carried Sophie back to their house. Back home, David dried Sophie with her special soft towel and wrapped her in her favorite purple blanket. She was still shaking, overwhelmed by the sudden trauma and the cold water. Emily, Sophie's mother and a nurse at the local hospital, was still at work. David called her with a steady voice, trying to mask his anger and fear. "Emily, something happened. Margaret." She pushed Sophie into the creek. Emily's voice sharpened with worry and disbelief. "Is she okay? Is she hurt?" "She's physically okay," David said, "but she's scared. So scared." Emily's voice grew resolute. "That woman can't get away with this. You have to do something." David had been a sheriff for 15 years. He'd seen violence, crime, and danger of all kinds, but nothing had ever made his blood boil like this. Margaret didn't know who David really was. To her, he was just another neighbor she could bully and intimidate. But she had no idea that she had just made a powerful enemy. David checked on Sophie one last time that night. She sat on the couch, watching cartoons but still flapping her hands gently, a coping mechanism that gave her some calm. He kissed her forehead and stepped outside, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. David's anger was a slow burn as he walked 2 streets over to Margaret's house. Her property was immaculate, a perfectly cut lawn, shiny mailbox, and perfectly arranged flower beds. Everything about it screamed control and authority. He knocked firmly on her door. Margaret opened it, dressed in a crisp white blouse, her fake smile quickly vanishing when she saw David's grim expression. "What do you want?" she snapped. David didn't waste words. "Why did you push my daughter into the creek?" Margaret's response was cold and dismissive. "She was breaking the rules. The HOA says no children can play near the creek without adult supervision." "She's a danger." David's voice hardened. "She's autistic. She's not a danger to anyone. You grabbed her and pushed her into water. That's assault and battery." Margaret shrugged. "If you can't follow community rules, maybe you shouldn't live here." David stared at her in disbelief. "You hurt my daughter, and you're proud of it?" Margaret laughed, dismissing his words. That night, David knew Margaret had crossed a line she couldn't come back from. But this was only the beginning of the fight for justice. The next morning, the weight of what happened pressed heavily on David Morrison as he sat behind his sheriff's desk, staring at the blank complaint form in front of him. The sterile room felt colder than usual, as if the walls themselves were wary of the darkness creeping into his normally steady world. Filing a complaint against Margaret Ellison was not just another case. She was the HOA president, a powerful figure with connections and influence. Everyone in the community walked on eggshells around her, and yet she had physically harmed his daughter, had shown a blatant disregard for Sophie's safety and well-being. David's fingers trembled slightly as he began to write down the details of the assault. Every word was a strike against the woman who had crossed an unforgivable line. He described Margaret's aggressive approach, the way she dragged Sophie, the shove that sent her tumbling into the creek. As he wrote, David recalled the look on Sophie's face. That frightened, confused gaze that no child should ever bear. The memory fueled his resolve. Later, David handed the complaint to his deputy, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just about property rules anymore, it's assault, and we're going to treat it like one." The deputy nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The wheels of justice were turning, but David knew the real battle would be much harder. News of the incident spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The next HOA meeting was tense and crowded. People whispered, in corners, casting nervous glances toward Margaret, who sat rigidly at the head of the room, her expression unreadable. David attended, partly to keep an eye on Margaret, partly to show the community that Sophie had support. When the meeting was called to order, Margaret launched into a defensive speech. "This has been blown out of proportion," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The creek is private property. We have rules to keep this neighborhood safe. If Sophie had been supervised, none of this would have happened." Murmurs erupted among the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. A few, neighbors, looked away, ashamed or unsure how to respond. David stood slowly, the room falling silent. "I'm Sheriff David Morrison," he said, his voice steady but charged. "What happened to my daughter isn't just about rules. It's about a person's safety and dignity. Sophie is autistic. She deserves respect and protection, not hostility and harm. I will not let anyone in this community threaten that." The room's energy shifted. Some neighbors clapped quietly, others stared at their feet. Margaret's face flushed red with anger. But David wasn't finished. "We need to come together, not tear each other apart. This neighborhood should be a place where every child, every family feels safe, not one ruled by fear or intimidation." That night, David knew the community was divided. Some saw Margaret's actions as an abuse of power. Others still feared her influence. But one thing was clear. The fight for Sophie's justice had ignited something much bigger. The story didn't stay local for long. A reporter from the regional news station caught wind of the incident, a sheriff's daughter assaulted by a powerful HOA president, and saw a story that could resonate with viewers. Within days, a camera crew was parked outside the Morrison house, lights flashing and microphones poised. David was reluctant at first but realized the media spotlight could bring needed attention to the issue. In front of the cameras, David spoke carefully but passionately. "My daughter is just one of many families struggling to live under an HOA that, instead of protecting us, threatens our safety and freedom. This is about more than rules. It's about humanity." The interview aired during the evening news, and responses flooded in. Calls of support poured from neighbors and strangers alike. But so did threats and backlash from Margaret's supporters. Margaret, unfazed, used the media attention to rally her base, painting herself as a victim of a smear campaign. She denied the assault, accusing David of trying to manipulate public opinion. The media storm escalated the conflict, but it also gave David and Sophie a platform. People began asking questions about HOA power and abuse, about how vulnerable families could be protected. David realized this was no longer a simple case of neighborly dispute. It was a battleground for justice, dignity, and change, with public attention mounting. The county prosecutor's office took notice. After reviewing the complaint and evidence, they agreed to press charges against Margaret Ellison for assault and endangering a child. David's role shifted from father and sheriff to plaintiff, preparing for a legal battle that promised to be long and painful. His attorney, a seasoned woman named Lisa Carmichael, reviewed the case with meticulous care. "This isn't just about the physical incident," Lisa said. "It's about proving intent and the pattern of harassment Margaret has enforced in the community." David nodded, understanding that the law was only one part of the fight. The court of public opinion, community attitudes, and Sophie's well-being were just as crucial. The courtroom became a new arena of conflict. Margaret's lawyers argued that Sophie was trespassing and that Margaret's actions were justified as HOA enforcement. David's team countered with medical records, witness testimonies, and expert reports on autism and child safety. The hearing was emotional, draining. David watched Sophie from the front row, her small hands clinging to his, her eyes wide but brave. Through it all, David remained a pillar of strength, fueled by his love and fierce determination to protect his daughter. Outside the courtroom and community meetings, Sophie's recovery became its own journey. The trauma had left scars, not just physical, but emotional and psychological. Sophie's world, once secure and predictable, had been shaken. David and Emily worked tirelessly to rebuild her sense of safety. They consulted specialists in autism therapy and child trauma, creating a nurturing environment full of routines, reassurance, and unconditional love. Sophie's favorite spot by the creek was temporarily off-limits, replaced by new places that felt safer: a nearby park, the quiet reading nook in their living room, and weekend trips to a therapy pool. Every day was a step forward and sometimes 2 steps back. Sophie's meltdowns became more frequent, her trust fragile. David stayed by her side, attending therapy sessions, learning how to communicate with her in ways that soothed her mind and heart. The community, slowly but surely, began to rally around the Morrison family. Neighbors offered help, brought meals, and shared kind words. David knew the road ahead was long, but Sophie's resilience inspired him. With every small smile and quiet moment of peace, he felt the promise of healing and hope. Despite the growing evidence and public support for David and Sophie, Margaret Ellison was far from defeated. Instead, she doubled down on her campaign to intimidate and discredit the Morrisons. It started subtly. Flyers appeared on doorsteps throughout the neighborhood, bearing Margaret's carefully worded accusations that David was abusing his position as sheriff to target innocent residents. The tone was veiled but unmistakable, a call to rally her supporters to defend her honor and the integrity of the community. Late at night, David found the tires of his patrol vehicle slashed. A note was taped to the windshield: "Stay out of HOA business." At first David brushed it off, but the message was clear. Margaret was willing to escalate to threats and harassment. More distressingly, Sophie began to regress. The meltdowns increased, the nightmares returned. The stress of the legal battle and the hostile atmosphere in the community weighed heavily on her. Emily, David's wife, grew increasingly worried. "David, this isn't just a legal fight anymore," she said one evening, her voice trembling. "It's a war of wills. We have to protect Sophie and ourselves." David nodded solemnly. He knew the stakes had never been higher. In the coming weeks, several neighbors approached David privately. Some were frightened, others were angry at Margaret's tactics. Quiet alliances formed behind closed doors. David's role shifted again. Not only sheriff and father, but protector of a community fractured by fear and mistrust. One of the hardest battles took place in Sophie's school. Autism specialists and teachers, although empathetic, struggled to cope with Sophie's sudden distress and behavioral changes. The principal called David and Emily in for a meeting. "We want to support Sophie," she said, "but we need a plan that addresses her unique needs, especially with everything that's been happening." David and Emily worked closely with school counselors and therapists to develop an individualized education plan, IEP, tailored to Sophie's current challenges. The goal was not only academic success but emotional healing. Sophie's classroom was modified with sensory tools: soft lighting, noise-canceling headphones, quiet corners for breaks. Her teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, became an important ally. Patient and kind, she took extra time to understand Sophie's triggers and comfort her when anxiety flared. Emily attended workshops on autism support, learning how to advocate effectively within the school system. For Sophie, the school became both a refuge and a test. Some days were breakthroughs filled with laughter and small victories. Other days were setbacks: tears, outbursts, withdrawal. David and Emily remained steadfast, their hope anchored by Sophie's resilience. While the conflict between the Morrisons and Margaret remained bitter, unexpected allies emerged. One neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, an elderly widow who had lived in the community for decades, began speaking out quietly in support of David. She had witnessed Margaret's escalating aggression and understood the toll it was taking on Sophie. At a community potluck, Mrs. Reynolds approached David. "I know it's been hard," she said softly, "but you're doing the right thing. We've seen enough fear here." Her words sparked a ripple effect. Other residents began sharing their own concerns, recounting times when Margaret had overstepped boundaries or bullied families. David's sheriff's office started receiving anonymous tips about HOA abuses, unreported fines, intimidation tactics, even forged documents. These revelations added fuel to the fire, strengthening the case against Margaret and raising broader questions about HOA oversight and accountability. David found comfort in these alliances. They reminded him that even in the darkest times, community strength and courage could prevail. The trial became a focal point for the entire neighborhood and local media. Days were spent in tense courtroom sessions where emotions ran high, and every detail was scrutinized. Margaret's defense was aggressive. Her lawyers attacked Sophie's credibility, questioning her behavior and the validity of David's claims. They tried to paint Sophie's condition as a weakness and suggested that the Morrisons had exaggerated the incident for sympathy. David sat stoic through it all, his heart breaking each time Sophie was questioned. She struggled under the bright lights and probing questions but clung tightly to Emily's hand. Witnesses testified on both sides. Some neighbors defended Margaret's character. Others shared stories of her harsh enforcement tactics. David's legal team presented compelling evidence: security footage from nearby homes, medical reports on Sophie's injuries and trauma, and expert testimony on autism and child safety. The judge listened carefully, weighing every argument. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered, holding signs and offering solidarity to the Morrison family. The trial was more than just about one assault. It was a test of justice, fairness, and community values. After weeks of legal battles, the judge finally delivered the verdict. The courtroom was packed. Sophie sat beside David, her small hand clutching his tightly. "Margaret Ellison," the judge began, voice steady, "your actions on the day in question were found to be reckless and unlawful. You are hereby charged with assault and endangering a minor." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Margaret's face twisted with fury, but she was silent. David exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Yet he knew this victory was only the beginning of healing. For Sophie, their family, and the community. Later, outside the courthouse, David spoke to reporters. "This case is about more than justice for my daughter. It's about ensuring safety, respect, and compassion for every family in this neighborhood and beyond." Sophie smiled shyly, leaning into her father's side. David promised himself he would do everything in his power to make sure no other child would suffer, as Sophie did.